Come with us on a journey to a place where information is unlocked, knowledge is gained, and the exchange of experiences welcome. This is the Knowledge Exchange, presented by Lakeland Community College.
Thank you. So, thank you for all being here. My name is Ricky Bartlett. I'm a geologist and a paleontologist. I started work on the Coconino Sandstone about 11 years ago when I was an undergraduate at Northern Arizona University, and I fell in love with the rock the moment I got on it. It is an amazing rock, and it's one of the few sort of real geologic mysteries left in the American Southwest. This is a really, really interesting rock, as you're going to see. So we're going to go ahead and I'll go ahead and get started. This is an artist's interpretation of what we think the Coconino must have looked like, or at least in places must have looked like. The Coconino is a sandstone. It is a very interesting sandstone in that it's particularly clean. It's very, very fine-grained. This sand has been around for a very long time, right? This sand has probably been parts of other rocks in the past. It is classified as a quartz-arenite, which means it is a very clean, mostly quartz sandstone. Very few other minerals, just trace amounts of mica and feldspars. As you can see, it is also exquisitely layered, which is interesting and fortuitous for us because this also makes this rock very valuable. It is mined and quarried extensively as a flagstone. In fact, most of the houses in the Phoenix metro area or in Las Vegas probably have Coconino sandstone either on their patio or in the house. When you go out to the areas around Flagstaff, there are just quarries for this rock everywhere, ranging from mom and pop operations all the way up to these monstrous commercial operations I'll show you some slides of, which is really lucky for us because unfortunately this rock in Grand Canyon and elsewhere is a cliff former, meaning that there are no horizontal surfaces available. So if it were not for these rock quarries, we would not have a lot of these fossils or a lot of this information that we have. So in the field, this is what the Coconino Sandstone looks like. Exquisite crossbeds, just beautiful, beautiful rock. What you're actually seeing here and what this represents are actually the faces of dunes. So this would be sort of the depositional environment that we interpret the Coconino to have been deposited under, something analogous to the Namib Desert in Africa or the Sahara Desert, a hyper-arid erg, meaning basically no water. Now, the way these formations are laid down is simply sand blowing over the top of a dune, being deposited on the other side, and producing this layering, which we see preserved in the geologic record. So what you're actually seeing are the faces of many different dunes, probably at different angles. These dunes would move across each other, planing a dune off, cannibalizing another dune as they migrate across the field. So we only preserve small portions of the dune, typically this part down here. So in other words, this was one dune face, another dune face, another dune face, alternating back and forth as these moved across each other. Now the Coconino outcrops all across northern Arizona, most famously of course in Grand Canyon, but it is extensively exposed throughout northern Arizona. And these sites are the sites of the quarries I mentioned around Ash Fork, Arizona, which calls itself, by the way, the flagstone capital of the world, which it probably is. So in Grand Canyon, of course, the Coconino is a really prominent rock. This is it across on the other side. When you go to the rim of the Grand Canyon, you're standing on the Kaibab Formation. Right beneath you is the Coconino Sandstone. So it is this cliff-forming member right here, which is, as I said, unfortunate because there's really no horizontal surfaces to work with. Now, I was fortunate enough to travel with my advisor at that time to a locale in Grand Canyon that we sort of caught wind of from some other geologists, and it turned out to be probably the richest trace fossil location I had ever seen. And it is actually represented, it is block fall coming off of this face and basically then falling onto the face of the Hermit below it. So it's not rock that's in place, but it does have ample horizontal surfaces, which have fossils and traces all over them. Now, fortunately for me, the National Park Service a couple of years ago did what they call a paleo blitz, where they went into the canyon with paleontologists, volunteers, interns, and basically tried to catalog everything in the canyon. Somehow they missed this site. So I've just permitted it for last year. I was actually traveled to Arizona, was about to go in with the park paleontologist, had my pack packed, ready to go, and she contracted COVID the day before. So we did not get to go in, so now we're going to go in, hopefully in spring break this spring, to look at this locale. I'll show you a lot of pictures from that locale in a little bit. So this is from the first trip I made to that locality. It's a beautiful place to work. If you ever get a chance to camp in Grand Canyon, it's a surreal experience. And we actually were there on the evening of Easter. So we woke up and couldn't figure out why there were so many people up on the rim that morning. We were just all like, why is everybody up there at the crack of dawn? And then we figured out later on, it was actually Easter morning. We just didn't realize it at the time, but we were in the canyon for that night. It is a beautiful experience. So this is a great place to work, right? This is a wonderful work area. This is me again and me on one of the track surfaces. These are actually a series of tracks going up one of these rocks that I mentioned that had detached from the cliff face above. And I'll show you a lot more about these tracks later. This is the cliff face. So this is my field area. I'm standing on that rubble looking up at the cliff face from which it came. And then it just basically falls down onto that surface. So this is the contact with the underlying hermit. And basically this is my former advisor, Dr. Elliott. And these are the blocks that we're looking at. And on the surfaces of these blocks are exquisite preservations of tracks of vertebrates as well as invertebrates, as well as environmental trace fossils, which I'll show you some of in a little bit. Just another picture of the field area. Oh yeah, and one of the denizens of our field area. I was actually fortunate enough to see one of these. This is the Grand Canyon rattlesnake. It is a western diamondback that has adapted its coloration to match the red rocks in Grand Canyon. So they are actually a beautiful pink. And the one I saw, fortunately, was on this really buff cream colored rock, and it was just gorgeous. I had no idea what I was looking at. I was walking from one block to another, almost stepped on him, stepped on the block, and there he was right there. And it was just beautiful. Of course, I didn't take this picture. By the time I got back with my camera, he was long since gone. But it was a real privilege to see one of these. I also work in the rock quarries south of Ash Fork. And some of these things are monstrous. And this pit actually goes down about another 80 feet or so on the other side of that berm. So they're mining this rock for flagstone and for aggregate because it makes a really good sand when you break it up. This is another picture of that operation. I mean, this thing is huge. They have big earth-moving equipment in here. And you can see, once again, the beds of the dunes going back and forth in different directions. This is another in the field of a smaller sort of mom-and-pop quarry where you can see the dune faces alternating directions. And these are where dunes were traveling this way, and then you're looking at it from a different orientation and then a different orientation. So you're switching views sort of back and forth. All right, so the time we're talking about is the Permian. The Permian is a very, very interesting time in Earth's history. It is a time in which basically the Permian is here. The first amniotes, which are the first animals capable of laying eggs, have evolved during the Pennsylvanian. These are animals that are no longer amphibians. They're no longer tied to the water for their reproduction. So they're capable of moving into the continental interior. And those animals are going to begin a diversification process during the Permian. At the end of the Pennsylvanian, actually toward the beginning of the Pennsylvanian, the rainforest which characterized the Carboniferous collapsed, because we're forming Pangea and the continental interiors are getting really, really dry. So the great coal swamps die, which is one of the reasons the amphibians have a downturn, and probably drives to some degree the evolution of these amniotes. And as these animals begin to diversify, we're going to break into two basic families, the synapsids and the cerapsids. In other words, we're going to form the divergence which is going to become us, lizards and snakes and modern reptiles, crocodiles, birds, and of course dinosaurs which develop birds, marine reptiles, and turtles. All of these families are going to diverge in the Permian. Now, of course, We're forming Pangaea, which is a supercontinent, and this has a profound effect on the climate. Because as this supercontinent forms, the continental interiors get very, very dry. It is difficult to transport moisture toward the continental interior at that time. So we see extreme aridity develop in North America, particularly in the Southwest, but all across North America as well. There are huge evaporite deposits throughout the United States, which are because of this aridity. Now, in the desert Southwest, that is manifested in what will become the Coconino Erg. So in essence, this big sand, the sea of sand, is the Coconino. Right? So this is that desert in which this rock is being deposited. These images are paleo reconstructions by Ron Blakey, who was a sedimentologist at Northern Arizona University. And he was one of the major workers in the Coconino. So I was fortunate to have worked with him. So the Coconino has been classically interpreted as a dry desert system. What that means is the sands are not stabilized. There are no interdune deposits in a dry aeolian system, meaning the dunes are free to migrate anywhere. They lack what are known as interdune deposits. Interdune deposits would be the areas between the dunes, the flat areas where the moisture is likely to accumulate. Now, in many deserts, these are flooded, or if not surface water, at least near surface water is present in these areas. Now, classically, the Coconino has been interpreted as lacking major interdune formations. So we'll come back to that later on. That's something I'm very, very interested in. So in other words, the Coconino probably represented in most places, or at least in many places, something very much like this, a sand sea. So here are some important things about the Coconino. There are no body fossils. We have no preservations of animals whatsoever. All right? There's no evidence of plants. We don't have any fossils of plants. We don't have any root cast, and we don't have any pollen. There's no direct evidence of primary production in this formation. There's no direct evidence of surface water, or really any suggestion that I've seen of heavy precipitation. We don't see incision of the dunes. We don't see gullying. We don't see things that really would be indicative of what would happen if you had heavy precipitation falling on a dune sea. We do see signs of rain. We see raindrop marks, but we don't see heavy precipitation. There are abundant tracks in the Coconino, but they are extremely localized, meaning you can go to 6 quarries and 5 of them will have no traces whatsoever, nothing preserved. And then the 6th one will be full of tracks. In other words, the tracks seem to be spatially localized in one place. This has always been a problem. And this was what sort of drew me into the Coconino. I worked with a graduate student, Amanda Millhouse, who was attempting to resolve this issue. Are they localized? And if they are, toward what end? Because one of the interpretations of the Coconino was that the animals weren't living here, that they were either migrating through, or that perhaps they were using the desert environment for reproductive purposes. Maybe it was an area where they went to lay their eggs. Maybe there isn't a need for an ecosystem here because the animals weren't actually living there. So one of the things Amanda did is we went to every quarry we could possibly get access to. We went into Grand Canyon and we recorded the direction of every track we could find. So in other words, we were trying to answer this question. Is there any preferred direction of travel? Is there any pattern or any sense to any of this? Is there any pattern to the localization of the traces? Turns out there isn't. We could not identify any meaningful pattern to this. So it doesn't appear that the animals were migrating through. There's no compelling model for how these traces are preserved. And after the talk, I invite you to come up and take a look at some of the fossils. Some of these are just exquisite preservation, and we don't know how this happens. We don't understand how that track becomes made, stabilized, buried, cemented, and preserved. It's one of the things I'm working on trying to figure out. Yet out in the middle of this sea, there is a diverse collection of animals. There is an ecosystem existing out there. And my answer to the migration question about where the animals migrating across the Coconino has always been, yeah, and they were taking the arthropods with them. Because there are extensive traces of insects as well, arthropods, within this formation. All right, so here's what we have. We have the preservation of traces. The biggest trace we have, of course, are the dunes themselves. This is a quarry near Ash Fork, and what they're doing is they're splitting this rock along these dune faces, along these bedding plains, and they're quarrying it out for construction purposes. So this is flagstone, right, to build the floors of the houses or the patios. These are the surfaces on which we find these traces, these tracks. Here's another quarry just showing some of these are really extensive dune faces. So this represents one of those spaces of a dune. This is a bounding surface, and you can actually see a bounding surface is an erosional surface, where I take a dune and I plane it off. The wind planes it flat, and you can see all of these layers, those represent those dune faces going into the rock. So in other words, if I had a lot of dune faces arranged like this, and I cut off the top flat, that's what I'm looking at here, that very top surface. Many of these bounding surfaces are also extremely large. Now, of course, the traces. You'll notice they're all lit very oddly. That's because in order to see these things, you really need oblique lighting. You really need lighting down at a low angle. So these are the tracks. Some of them are quite long. They are really difficult. It has been really problematic to work out what these animals were. And the main problem we have is when I see tracks, if you see a human track in the sand, you sort of intuitively know it's a human track, right? Because it has a given shape, a given morphology. The problem with this environment is that the animal is making these tracks in dry sand, which is inclined around 20 plus degrees. The animal could be moving directly up the slope, it could be moving horizontally, or it could be moving diagonally. Meaning that the morphology or the shape of the track is very dependent on the surface, the environment, and the animal's behavior. So in other words, a single animal could make several tracks that would appear very different from each other. It's always been hard to work out how many animals were actually present in this environment because the track's morphology was not precise. Now, if an animal makes a track in mud that is flat and horizontal, and he's walking at a nice pace, he makes a track that is identifiable as his foot, right? We can then match that foot to that track. So I can look at these tracks and see how many animals were there. In the Coconino, I can't do that because the track morphology is so diverse because of the conditions. There are lots of tracks. There are small ones and there are big ones. This is in Marble Canyon. These tracks are this big, right? These are really big animals out there. This is some from my field area in Grand Canyon. And showing you exactly, I mean, these are really large animals, and you can see the toe drags as the animal was lifting his foot through the sand. I'll also point out, there are invertebrate tracks on this same surface, right? This is a surface in which we have this animal track, the vertebrate track, but we also have invertebrate burrows on the very same surface. This is that trackway, or one of the trackways I mentioned at that Grand Canyon locality. So this is a series of 3 trackways heading up this rock. So the animal was walking up the dune face. This is just a close-up of that animal's track. And this is sort of what we interpret this animal to have looked like. And what he was doing was walking out in this sand, leaving these tracks. We also do have scorpions, that's the reason for the scorpion, as well as spiders and various unclassified and identified arthropods. So this is a couple of slides from my field area, which is that strewn field. And this place is just littered with tracks. They are literally everywhere. So for whatever reason, at this place, animals were everywhere, right? You go 300 yards down the cliff face and there's not a track one. You go another 300 yards that way and there's nothing. So for whatever reason, they were here. And they were here extensively throughout this section, right? They weren't just there for a period of time. These are some of the arthropods. These are spider tracks. Now, of course, you can't tell if it's a spider or a scorpion if you don't have the tail drag, right? Because when the sand is really hot, scorpions will actually lift their tail and they won't drag it across the sand. So they don't always make a tail drag. We do sometimes have the tail drag, sometimes we don't. We also have various burrows, right? Some of these have been worked on and classified, but the majority of them haven't. But these are just animals, arthropods, insects, burrowing through the sediment. And just a few more examples of those. This is a surface from my field area in Grand Canyon, which this surface, when I saw this, it blew my mind. This surface is so heavily bioturbated. I mean, it is just ate up with invertebrate tracks. And this is not uncommon at this locale. We saw several surfaces with this degree of bioturbation. What that tells me is this was not just an isolated few arthropods living here. This was an extensive collection of arthropods living in situ in one place. We also preserve features of the dunes themselves. This is sand flow, sand flowing down the surface of the dune. We preserve raindrop marks, which is evidence of some precipitation. But of course, in order to preserve the raindrop marks, the precipitation has to be light. If it's really, really heavy, you would obliterate the raindrop marks, of course, right? Because they would all impact upon each other. We also have these. This is a very interesting location within the Coconino. These are desiccation cracks. These are cracks that are produced when the sand dries out. Yes, that's critical, because that meant that this sand was dry and subsequently, or was wet and subsequently dried. It also means it has a high clay content, because you have to have a cohesiveness to the sand in order to produce these. Now, there is a sedimentologist, Larry Middleton, who has offered a alternative theory to this, and I sort of buy his argument. He's claiming that it's actually the formation of sedimentary minerals in situ after the fact, which is possible. But we see these also on surfaces which are not suggestive of that process. So I've stuck with the interpretation of them being desiccation cracking for now. Now, we also have a trace which we published on about 5 years ago. We published at a journal on the Permo-Triassic transition just to get it out there. But we have these features which we're interpreting as pit traps, something analogous to a modern antline burrow. And for those of y'all who have never seen antlines, they're called doodle bugs. Anybody ever heard of doodle bugs? You have them here. They're a larva that lives at the bottom of this pit, and when an ant wanders by, it throws sand up at them. It will actually literally throw little clumps of sand up in an attempt to knock them down into the pit, where it will then eat them. Sort of a miniature sarlacc, if you will. And this is what we're interpreting these traces to be. We published this several years ago, just in that journal to get it out there, and nobody has come back with a compelling alternative explanation yet. So we're pretty shortly going to formally publish on this and suggest an ichnotaxa for it. These are just some more pictures of those traces, and I have some examples up here if you'd like to see them afterwards. Also, recently on my last trip to the quarries, I found numerous more examples of these pit traps. So they do appear to at least be common. Now, how can these animals possibly be living in the Coconino, if they are in fact living there, right? We have to come up with some way to support this ecosystem. So people have suggested, as a modern analog to the Coconino, the Namib Desert in Africa. And the reason they suggest this is it has a similar sedimentary depositional system, a dune sea. But something is very unique about the Namib. They have these frequent recurring fogs. Because of a cold water current off the coast, you get fogs that form very frequently within the Namib. These fogs roll off the ocean across the dunes, and this is actually an important source of moisture for the animals who live in this desert. The animals there have adapted behaviors and structures to actually harvest the fog. Beetles will extend their wings. Reptiles have these capillary furrows on their body that will direct the water up toward their cheeks so they can lick it off. So that's an important source of water into this ecosystem. So the problem, you see my sort of sarcastic subtitle. Some people just want the fogs, and we'll get to why they want them in a little bit. I've never bought the Namib as a modern analog. It's not really analogous to the Coconino in my mind. In fact, I have a paper that I wrote in my climate dynamics course years ago that I'm about to submit, hopefully over Christmas break, for publication, basically demonstrating that you cannot produce fogs in the Coconino. There are not the conditions necessary to produce these fogs. Because of its paleogeographic configuration, the absence of any cold water currents, there simply are no mechanisms to produce fogs. So this idea of recurring fogs in the Coconino system really isn't a viable idea. Also, one of the big problems, this is a food web for the Namib Desert. Their apex predator is approximately 0.5 kilogram. Right? This is a system which is extremely resource limited. The plant material is primarily stuff that blows in or a few plants growing in situ. A lot of the moisture input is from this moisture harvesting, and the animals are all quite small. When you look at the animals living in the Coconino, and this is a recent reclassification of the tracks. What they did was they went to the museums and they tried to identify tracks that represent the true track. In other words, a track that has not been modified greatly by the conditions of the dune face or the gait or behavior of the animal. So they've tried to get back to a true morphology to the tracks. And then they take these tracks and they compare them to tracks elsewhere where they do have body fossils. And then they can start to correlate what animals were present in the Coconino. So this is a much more diverse taxa than we originally thought. And some of these animals are quite interesting. If his interpretation is correct, and I tend to think it is, there are some very interesting critters living out here. Some of these interesting critters are animals which are reptilian but still possess amphibian characteristics. So in other words, we may have amphibian-like animals living in this environment. One of the big problems I've always had with the Namib as well is simply the trophic nature of the food web. These animals are much larger than anything you see in the Namib, right? The Namib food web simply could not support the mass, the body mass, and the nutrition requirements of these animals, right? So the food webs are not analogous. They are completely out of tune with each other. All right, but here's the real mystery. This is what I am currently trying to address. How do we preserve these spider tracks in an erosive environment? These tracks have to be made in dry sand, because if the sand is moist, the spider will not make a track. He'll just walk across the surface of the sand, right? So we have to make the track in dry sand. Then we have to stabilize the track. We have to prevent it from being destroyed by the wind or in the process of filling it in. So we have to moisten it in order to stabilize it. That has always been the suggestion. Now do you see why people like the fogs? They've always invoked the fogs as a stabilizing agent to preserve these traces. Then we infill the track from this grain fall. This sand blowing over the top of the dune falls down onto the surface containing the tracks and fills them in. Right? Then we have to bury it and we have to cement it. Now, what I'm trying to do is to look at this preservational mechanism, to try and understand what is actually responsible for the stabilization and preservation of the tracks. Because if I can get some information about that, I'm hopeful that it will give us some insights into the ecology, into the environment of the system. So I'm focusing on, firstly, disproving the possibility of recurrent fogs. We have to get rid of the fogs, and we have to get rid of the Namib as a modern analog. It's not a suitable analog. The truth is we don't have an analog. There is nothing in the modern world that is equivalent to the Coconino depositional system or ecology. So we are limited by that. We're going to formally describe and name the pit trapping traces. That's something I'm currently working on with my former advisor. I'm going to get back in Grand Canyon sometime in the spring and write up a formal description of this locality so that we can get it in the literature and start classifying the tracks there, start seeing exactly what we have in the vertebrate and invertebrate fauna. I'm also looking at these preservational mechanisms. What is responsible for preserving these tracks? I'm also really interested in these interdune deposits, right? Because my feeling has always been that there is water present in the Coconino. There has to be, right? And if it's there, it's going to be in these interdune deposits. So hopefully, I want to go into Grand Canyon and other locations and do a systematic survey looking for interdune deposits. and then attempt to classify them sedimentologically in a way they haven't necessarily been done before. One of the things I'm doing with the tracks, this is what I'm currently doing, is I'm taking the tracks and I'm going to cut a section through the track. I'm going to do that with a rock saw that I just got from a grant from the Lakeland Foundation. Thank you very much. They have been very gracious in supporting my research. I am then going to produce a lithographic thin section of that section through the track. So I'm going to be looking at how the sand is cemented together. What is the chemistry of the cementation? What are the physical characteristics of the sand that make that track somehow distinct from the surrounding sand? Because it has to be. It exists within the sand, correct? Otherwise, if the track were not somehow distinct, it would just be a mass of sand. So I'm going to be looking at the fossils in thin section, not only tracks, but other traces as well, environmental and invertebrate traces, to try and find out if there are any clues in the lithology of the cements as to what is the preservational mechanism. I also got a really nice lithographic polarizing microscope for this purpose. This allows me to analyze the mineralogy of the cements and the sand grains themselves. So I can look at the adjoining sand and then the sand within the trace itself. One of the things we're also doing is we're actually doing 3D scans. I'm using a scanner that the engineering department had recently acquired to actually produce three-dimensional scans of the traces, because I'm going to destroy the trace. And that makes Grand Canyon very nervous. They were very cautious about granting my permit because of the fact that I'm going to be taking the fossils and destroying them, right? I'm going to be not only doing the thin sections, but I'm going to be powdering portions of them for X-ray diffraction analysis as well. So one of the things that helped sort of lubricate that process along was the fact that I'm going to be able to scan and then print the actual trace fossil itself. So in other words, I will have an exact copy of the fossil before I destroy it. And that is going to really help matters greatly. Because when I do go back into Grand Canyon, anything I want to collect, the park paleontologist has to sign off on. So I have to say, can I have this? And she's going to say yes or no. So hopefully this will greatly help that process. I'm hopeful at least. We've worked on scanning a couple of things. We're still in sort of the process of figuring out how to do this, but it should be something that's imminently doable. So what is my interpretation? My interpretation of the Coconino is that yes, it is a hybrid arid desert, but it is a hybrid arid desert with interdune deposits and water available. Now, is this a water available all the time? Maybe not. Maybe it is seasonal. Maybe there is some variation to this availability, right? But there has to be surface or near surface water available, in my opinion, to support this ecosystem. There's just no way that this ecosystem is existing in this environment without primary production. You have to have primary production. You cannot feed these animals with windblown detritus. So you must have some plants, even though we have not yet found the evidence of that, or the evidence may not have been preserved. There are interdune deposits in the Coconino. I know that. I've seen them. I've walked on them. I've been there. They're there. It's just going to be a matter of systematically mapping them out and examining the sedimentology of them so that we can convince people that these are interdune deposits and they do represent available surface water or near surface water. That's my future work. That's one of the things I hope to do, is to go back into Grand Canyon after I've completed the work with the preservation, is to go back into Grand Canyon and systematically collect a high resolution sampling throughout the entire Coconino section at this locale where I'm working now, as well as a nearby locale, so that we can look at the sedimentology of the Coconino through the entire section in detail. That has not been done before. People have just done it in isolated places. We have not looked at it systematically. And really finally solve, or at least put this interdune question to rest. Because as I said, many geologists have classified some of these sections of the Coconino as being interdune. So that's one of the things I want to attempt to do. I also want to do something, really the invertebrates This gentleman who did the work on the vertebrates did a splendid job, right? We have a much better idea now about the vertebrate taxonomy of the area. But we still really know very little about the invertebrates. There's not been a lot of work done on the invertebrates. So that's something I would like to do in the future, is to go to the museums and to the field and really try to classify what invertebrates, get a better handle on what sort of arthropods were there and what their diversity is. In closing, I will point out the luckiest geologist in the world. This is a formation below the Coconino, back in the Pennsylvanian, in Grand Canyon, which he was just walking along a trail and happened to see this boulder with tracks on it. These are amniote tracks. And the importance of this find, this is the oldest known body fossil of an amniote. This is the age of those tracks in Grand Canyon. So this really calls into question when amniotes actually evolved, because if amniotes evolved here in a moist environment near oceans and rivers, did they really invade the continental interior in that brief period of time? That's unlikely. So I really want to get into this formation below the Coconino and look at its fauna as well. All right, that is the end of the talk. Any questions at all? Anything at all you'd like to know? Yes?
I'm curious, so what makes you want to research this? Is it because it's like untapped, or you just...
Yeah, you know, the thing that really attracted me to the Coconino was the fact that I was somewhat in disbelief when I first started working on it, that this rock in Grand Canyon, that work was began on this back in, 100 years ago, that nobody had yet puzzled this out. Nobody had yet figured out what's really going on with this rock. And we still don't know. We still don't really understand that much about the Coconino. And it's something that honestly people just said, okay, it's a hypodarid erg, it's got some tracks in it, let's move on to other things. And that's kind of what they did. The research on it basically died for a long period of time until Amanda picked up her research project. There really wasn't any work being done in it. And it's just a rock that I've spent hundreds of hours out walking the surfaces of the Coconino. And it's a beautiful rock. When you're out standing on this dune face, seeing these tracks, it's just an amazing place to work. And it's one of those things that I really hope to solve this. Yeah.
So if it was so arid and we don't have any evidence of heavy precipitation,
yep.
How do you think that interdune deposits were able to stay in one spot consistently?
Yeah. They weren't. They almost certainly didn't stay in one spatial location at all times. And that's what we see in other systems. They probably were temporarily available in a given location. One of the biggest problems with my field area is I have very good spatial control. I know all of these animals, all of these invertebrates were living at this place, but I don't know when they were living there because these are blocks detached from the face. I don't have any stratigraphic control. Therefore, I don't have any temporal control. So it's very possible that interdune formation that was at this location was only there for a brief period of time. And maybe it was intensely inhabited for that period of time. 70% of the rock face may have no traces on it at all. I don't know. There's no way for me to take this block and put it back together. Except for a conversation that Bobby Oliver and I have had about maybe going in and doing LiDAR and doing 3D scans of the blocks and seeing if it is all possible to piecemeal them back together to some degree. Because they are large blocks. These are much bigger than these podiums, as big as these desks. Some of them are room-sized blocks, so they're big. If we could get three-dimensional scans of them, maybe. Then we could sort of say, where they actually exist in this section. Anything else? Anything at all? Anything from the biologist? I always love to hear from biologists.
All right, so I'm confused about how these reptilian/amphibious reptilians survive in this environment, and how far they would have had to have come from any sort of ecosystem that they would have been able to be numerous in.
When you go to the southeast of here, there is a nearby ecosystem. That's an excellent question. And this is sort of what I've always hinged my hopes Why? Oh, that's the end slide, not the beginning. Let me go back and answer your question. So, in this region down here in New Mexico, we have both tracks and body fossils. Along with preservation of plant material, wood material, we have a wet environment. In fact, a lot of the Coconino in the southeast portion of the Coconino has been interpreted as a Sabkha environment, which is a flooded dune system. We see minerals present in the rock which are suggestive of evaporation. So yes, there were portions of the Coconino to the southwest that were quite wet. So there are adjoining areas in which the animals could potentially migrate into the desert from. Go ahead.
So you didn't see any evidence of migratory pathways?
No. We saw no preferred direction to the
And
tracks.
there's nothing necessarily on the other side of this that would have another oasis?
No, you're right. But and also, I mean, the arthropod communities, the degree of bioturbation that is present in locations, these are these are extensive in situ communities of arthropods living there. So, yeah, I know, right? Any suggestions?
I'm a botanist, I don't know.
Yeah, Welwitschia. I hang my hopes on Welwitschia.
You know what, I had that thought, if there's any evidence of it, it's over in the mid.
There are fossils in the Museum of Northern Arizona and in Grand Canyon Museum, which early workers attributed as root cast, some even as leaf impressions. They're not highly suggestive when you look at them. So in other words, there's not a smoking gun. There are some fossils which are suggestive of plant material, but there's no fossil that you can say, that is a plant fossil and it will not start a bar fight. You know, if you bring these things out to paleobotanists, they're gonna start fights because they're gonna say that's not a plant fossil. You know? So no, we don't have unambiguous evidence of plant fossils.
This has been The Knowledge Exchange, a Lakeland Community College production.